My neighbor Carla just spent $400 on a doorbell camera for an apartment she doesn't own. Not because she needed the security, because she wanted to feel, for once, like a place was actually hers, even if the lease says otherwise. And when I saw that little camera blinking above her door, I realized something that most money videos never say out loud. The fight between renting and buying was never really about houses. It's about what people are trying to prove to themselves. My name is Daniel, and today I want to walk you through the real math behind the biggest financial decision most Americans will ever make, because almost everyone gets it wrong in the exact same direction, and almost nobody notices until 15 years have already gone by. Here's where it starts. A guy named Marcus, 34, works in logistics outside Columbus, Ohio, makes about $82,000 a year, and has been renting the same two-bedroom for 6 years because his landlord hasn't raised the rent much, and honestly, life's been fine. His sister Priya, same age, similar income, bought a house 2 towns over 4 years ago. At every family dinner, there's this quiet tension neither of them says out loud. Priya thinks Marcus is setting money on fire every month. Marcus thinks Priya is chained to a mortgage and a lawn she didn't even want to mow. Neither one has ever actually sat down and run the numbers. They've just picked a side and started defending it, the way people defend a sports team they were born into rather than one they chose. That's the first thing worth noticing, and it's rarely talked about. Most people don't decide to rent or buy based on math. They decide based on identity. Buying a home in America has been sold as the finish line of adulthood for 70 years, ever since the government started subsidizing mortgages after World War II to build a nation of homeowners who'd have too much invested in the system to want to burn it down. It worked. It worked so well that owning a home stopped being a financial decision and became a personality trait, which means when Marcus says he's still renting, there's a flinch in his voice, even though nobody actually asked him to explain himself. So let's actually do what Marcus and Priya never did and run the real numbers, because the honest math is stranger than either of them assumes. Priya's house cost $390,000. She put 10% down, $44,000 once you count closing costs, and her mortgage payment lands at $2,200 a month. But that's not what the house costs her. Add property taxes, which in her county run about $4,400 a year. Add homeowner's insurance, which has crept up to nearly $200 a month because her state has had 300-year floods in the last 8 years, which tells you everything about how insurers are quietly repricing climate risk into your monthly bill whether you notice it or not. Add private mortgage insurance because she put down less than 20%, another $130 a month until she claws her way to enough equity, and add maintenance, which nobody budgets for correctly because it doesn't arrive as a bill, it arrives as a phone call. Her water heater failed 11 months in. That was $1,800 she hadn't planned for, sitting right next to the good feeling of finally owning something. Marcus, meanwhile, pays $1,900 a month in rent for a comparable place, and that number includes everything. No surprise water heaters, no county reassessing his taxes upward because home values in the area jumped, no insurance company sending a letter about a new flood zone. When you add up Priya's real monthly cost, taxes, insurance, PMI, and a fair estimate for maintenance, she's paying closer to $3,000 a month, not $2,200. The gap between what she's actually spending and what Marcus spends is roughly $1,100 every single month. If Marcus takes that difference and the money he saved by not making a down payment and actually invests it in a plain index fund instead of letting it dissolve into DoorDash and a slightly nicer car, he's not the one falling behind in this story. He might be the one quietly winning it. But here's where it gets interesting, because I'd be lying to you if I stopped there and called Marcus the smart one. Priya has something Marcus doesn't, and it's not the house itself, it's the structure around it. Her mortgage payment is frozen. It will be $2,200 in year 1, and it will still be $2,200 in year 20, while Marcus's rent has already crept from $1,900 toward $2,300 because rent, unlike a fixed mortgage, moves with the market every single renewal. There's a name for what's happening to Priya that almost nobody uses correctly. She is short inflation on her biggest expense. Prices around her are rising, but her core housing cost is locked. Marcus, whether he realizes it or not, is long inflation on his rent, and inflation almost always wins in the end. There's also a psychological trap hiding inside Marcus's plan, and it's the same trap that quietly wrecks most renters who swear they'll invest the difference. The plan only works if he actually does it, And the data on this is almost embarrassing. Most people who say they'll invest what they save from renting instead spend it on lifestyle creep so gradual they never notice the leak. A slightly bigger apartment because he could afford it, a car payment that crept from $300 to $500 because the old car felt like it was time, a few extra trips a year because he doesn't have a mortgage weighing him down, so why not? None of these decisions feel reckless in the moment. Each one feels like a small, reasonable upgrade, but stacked over a decade, they quietly consume the exact $1,100 a month that was supposed to be building Marcus's future, and he ends up with nothing to show for the discipline he swore he'd have. This is the part of the whole debate that never makes it into the thumbnail. A mortgage isn't really a savings plan, but it accidentally functions like one because the bank forces the discipline that most people can't force on themselves. Every month, whether Priya feels like it or not, part of her payment chips away at the loan. Nobody has to feel motivated. It just happens, automatically, whether she's had a great year or a terrible one. Marcus has no such mechanism. His plan to invest the difference depends entirely on willpower holding steady for 20 straight years, and willpower is the least reliable financial instrument ever created. Quick pause here, because if you're the kind of person actually thinking about running these numbers for your own life instead of just picking a side at Thanksgiving, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists for. So if that sounds like you, go ahead and subscribe, because we're about to get into the part of this that actually flips the whole story. Here's the twist most people never see coming, and it has nothing to do with either of their monthly payments. It's about what happens the day they try to leave. If Marcus gets a job offer across the country next spring, he gives 30 days notice and he's gone. No realtor, no staging his apartment for strangers, no praying the market cooperates on his timeline. If Priya gets the same offer, she has to sell an entire house first, hand over 5 to 6% of the sales price to an agent, and hope a buyer shows up before the new job starts without her. Renting isn't just cheaper in some scenarios, it's a form of financial optionality that homeowners quietly give up the moment they sign, and almost nobody prices that flexibility into the decision, even though for a lot of people under 40, especially in an economy where nobody stays at one job for a decade anymore, that flexibility might be worth more than the equity itself. And there's a risk sitting inside Priya's win that never makes it onto the brochure either. Her entire net worth for now is one house on one street in one town tied to one regional job market. If the county's biggest employer packs up or another one of those 100-year floods shows up for the fourth time in a decade, her single undiversified asset takes the full hit and she can't exactly sell off the guest room to cover it. Marcus's money, if he actually invests it, is spread across hundreds of companies on multiple continents. One of them could collapse tomorrow and he'd barely notice. So who actually wins, Marcus or Priya? The honest answer, the one that never trends on social media because it doesn't fit in 15 seconds, is that it depends on two things nobody wants to sit down and calculate. First, how long you're actually going to stay put, because the break-even point where buying starts beating renting usually lands somewhere between 5 and 7 years, and if you move before that, the closing costs and agent fees eat your advantage alive. And second, and this is the one that stings, whether you're honestly, brutally certain you'd invest the difference instead of letting it evaporate into a nicer lifestyle you didn't even notice choosing. If you know deep down you wouldn't, buying might genuinely be the better decision for you, not because real estate is magic, but because it protects you from yourself. If you found this useful, stick around and subscribe, because next week I'm running the numbers on what happens when someone tries to do both at once, buying a home and investing aggressively on the same income, and the outcome is not what most people expect. What Marcus and Priya both missed is that they were never actually arguing about houses. They were arguing about which version of financial discipline they trusted more, a bank forcing their hand or their own willpower carrying them for 20 straight years. Neither one is wrong. Neither one is a fool. They just never stopped defending a side long enough to run their own numbers for their own city, their own rent, their own rate, their own honest read on whether they'd actually invest the difference or quietly spend it. So here's the question I want you to sit with in the comments. If you're honest with yourself, do you actually trust yourself to invest the difference, or do you need the mortgage to force your hand?